I woke up early, like I always did, but something was different. The house was unusually silent. My husband Dan had left for a business trip, and Jake, Dan's son from his first marriage, stayed behind. We hadn't spent much time together recently, and as soon as I stepped out of the bedroom, I felt it. The tension in the air, thick and almost suffocating. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the kind of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. Our home on the outskirts of the city had always been quiet, nestled in a neighborhood that felt timeless and familiar. It was the kind of place where people whispered on the streets and the trees swayed gently with the wind. It was peaceful, and I used to find comfort in its stillness. But today, it felt foreign. I stood in the kitchen, brewing my usual cup of coffee, trying to grasp the sudden unease that settled around me like a fog. I should have felt relief, a sense of space, but instead, my chest tightened. Jake had grown up and we had drifted apart. It had been a while since we really talked. As I stirred my coffee, I couldn't help but notice how his presence seemed to hang in the air, a presence I could no longer quite understand. I thought of the times we had shared in the past, when things were simpler, when he was a child who still wanted to spend time with me. But now it felt as though we were two strangers living under the same roof. I glanced at the hallway, half expecting to see him wandering around, but he was nowhere to be found. The house felt empty, though it wasn't. He was here, somewhere, but his absence was louder than any sound could be. How had we gotten here? The distance between us felt more like a vast ocean now, and I wasn't sure if it was even worth trying to bridge it. The day stretched on, as days often do when you're trying to avoid confronting something you don't want to face. I tried to shake off the heaviness in the air by doing the things that usually grounded me: cleaning, organizing, keeping my mind busy. It was the only way to make time feel like it had a purpose. I started with the attic, sorting through old boxes that had been gathering dust. There was always something nostalgic about the clutter of forgotten things that didn't quite fit in with the present, but carried memories of who I once was. I pulled down a cardboard box labeled "summer clothes," and as I lifted the lid, the familiar smell of old fabric and time-worn paper hit me. Inside, I found pieces of my past. A summer dress I used to wear when I was younger, an old scarf that had long since lost its color, and buried at the very bottom, my favorite hat. It was a wide-brimmed straw hat, the one I'd worn on so many adventures before life had become so routine. Back then, it was a symbol of freedom, a symbol of the woman I once was, the woman who was spontaneous, confident, and full of life. I could almost feel the warmth of the sun on my face again as I remembered the countless days I spent walking around the city, laughing with friends, feeling like I was in control of my own life. But over time, that woman had faded. The hat had become nothing more than a forgotten relic of a time I wasn't sure I could even remember clearly. I held it in my hands for a moment longer, feeling the weight of it, the weight of the past, of who I had been. Then, almost reluctantly, I placed it back in the box. I knew there was no use in trying to cling to something that had slipped away. Life had changed. It always did. And I had changed with it. But standing there in the dusty attic, surrounded by the remnants of another life, I felt the sharp sting of what I had lost. I tried to shake off the melancholy, but it lingered. The silence in the house, the way it seemed to press in on me from every side, felt even more oppressive now. Jake's absence seemed to fill every corner, every room. I couldn't escape it. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I had managed to bury myself in the mundane details of the day. I chopped vegetables for dinner, wiped down countertops, and rearranged the bookshelves in the living room. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the feeling that something was terribly wrong never left. It was as if the house had absorbed Jake's silence, and now it was a part of everything, following me from room to room. As I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering. I thought about the years that had passed since Jake had lived with us full-time. He was older now, a teenager, and somehow we had become strangers to each other. He had always been quiet, but it felt like there was more to it now, something deep, something I couldn't quite reach. I had tried to connect with him before, to bridge that gap, but it always felt like pushing against a wall. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening interrupted my thoughts. I froze, my hand still on the spoon, as I heard footsteps approaching. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could fully process what was happening, Jake appeared in the doorway. He stood there, looking at me with those dark, unreadable eyes of his. There was a stillness between us, as if he had been watching me for a while, trying to figure out whether or not to speak. I tried to smile, but the expression felt foreign on my face. I was hoping for some sort of conversation, something to break the awkwardness that had been growing between us, but when I looked at him, all I could see was that same unreadable look. His lips didn't move. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't say anything at all. I opened my mouth, unsure of what I even wanted to say, but nothing came out. It was like a knot had formed in my throat, keeping me silent. For a moment, we just stood there. The world around us seemed to hold its breath. It felt like time had stopped, like we were caught in some kind of suspended animation, unable to move forward or backward. And then, as if he couldn't stand the weight of the silence any longer, Jake turned and walked away without a word. The door to his room clicked shut behind him, and the silence descended again. But this time, it wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. I went back to the stove, stirring the soup with the same rhythm, the same motion, but it felt automatic. I couldn't focus on the task anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. What was going on in his mind? Why couldn't we talk? I could hear him moving around in his room, the occasional sound of something shifting, a drawer opening and closing. But there was nothing else. No music, no laughter, no words. Just that deep, unyielding silence, stretching out between us like an insurmountable chasm. I felt a pang in my chest, a sudden ache that made it hard to breathe. I had always known that things between us weren't the same as they used to be, but now it was undeniable. We were both trapped in this strange, quiet space, unable to reach each other. I didn't know what to do anymore. What could I do? For the rest of the afternoon, I carried on with the motions of life. But the weight of it all, Jake's silence, his distance, stayed with me, heavy and unrelenting. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both standing on the edge of something, waiting for it to fall apart. Dinner was supposed to bring us together, but instead, it felt like a quiet struggle. I set the table, hoping the act of sitting down would somehow break the growing distance between us. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, a comforting scent, but it couldn't mask the heaviness that lingered. Jake sat down before me, his eyes fixed on his plate. I tried to smile, asking, "How was your day?" hoping for a response, but all I got was the sound of his fork scraping against the plate. I tried again. "Are you feeling okay?" My voice was softer this time, but he didn't look up. Instead, he pushed his chair back and stared out the window, avoiding my gaze. The silence stretched between us, suffocating. The meal went untouched. Each word I spoke seemed to fall flat, as if he couldn't hear me or didn't want to. I was desperate to break through, to find some way to make him see that I was still here, but every attempt was met with cold silence. Finally, he stood up, muttered a quick "good night," and disappeared into his room, leaving me sitting in the quiet of the empty dining room. The silence was unbearable, and I couldn't help but wonder how we had ended up here, so far apart, despite sitting in the same room. The next morning, I woke up early again, the house still wrapped in that same thick silence. I went about my morning routine, moving through the motions without thinking much about it. But as I walked past Jake's room, something caught my eye. Something strange. His door was open, just slightly ajar, and the room seemed unnervingly quiet. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then I stepped inside, expecting to find him still asleep or maybe reading quietly in the corner. But the bed was empty. His things were gone. The clothes he had left scattered on the floor the day before, now gone. His desk, which was usually littered with papers and half-finished school assignments, was empty. I froze. It didn't make sense. Where could he have gone? I quickly walked over to his desk and noticed a small note lying on top of it. My heart sank as I picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was Jake's, neat and deliberate, but the words felt cold, distant. I needed some space. I'll be back soon. That was it. No explanation, no indication of when he'd return, or why he felt the need to leave without a word. It felt like a punch to the gut, and I couldn't breathe for a moment. I stood there, staring at the note, trying to understand why he hadn't said anything to me. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was stand there, clutching the paper in my hands. The silence in the house was now deafening. Jake had gone, just like that, without a trace, and I couldn't help but feel that everything had fallen apart in a way I never saw coming. Dan returned home a few days later, and I had to smile for him. His presence, as much as I wanted it to ease the emptiness, only seemed to highlight how much had changed. His excitement upon walking through the door, telling me about his trip, his work, the things he'd seen, felt distant to me. I could tell he was glad to be home, but I felt like I was drifting further away from him too. We sat in the living room, a place that had once been full of conversation, but now it was like we were sitting in two separate worlds. He asked me how I'd been, and I responded with short answers, not wanting to burden him with the truth. The truth about Jake's sudden departure, the cold silence that had settled between us like a weight neither of us could lift. "I hope you've been okay," Dan said, settling into his chair, his voice filled with concern. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him what had happened. What was I supposed to say? That Jake had left without a word? That our home had become a place filled with unspoken tension? No, I couldn't do that. I didn't want to make things harder than they already were. I told him about the everyday things, the chores I'd been doing, the meals I'd prepared, small talk, the kind we had always used to fill the space when we didn't know what else to say. But as we spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing between us too. It wasn't just Jake, it was everything. The way we used to talk, laugh, and connect. Now it felt like it had all slipped through our fingers. Dan kept talking, telling me stories from his trip, trying to fill the silence in his own way. But all I could think about was the emptiness in the house, the empty room where Jake used to sleep, the note he had left behind. I wanted to tell Dan, to explain what was happening, but the words felt stuck in my throat. The silence between us was different now, and I didn't know how to break it. I didn't know how to fix what had been broken. Days passed, and the weight of Jake's absence lingered. The house felt colder somehow, emptier, even with Dan's return. I went through the motions, trying to keep up with everything, but it was as if time had frozen, leaving me trapped in a place I couldn't escape. Then, one afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table, a letter arrived. I wasn't expecting anything, so when I saw the familiar handwriting, Jake's, my heart skipped. I hadn't heard from him since he left. The note he had left behind barely explained anything, and my mind had been spinning ever since. But now here was a letter, his words. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded the page. The words were simple, but they hit me harder than I expected. "I'm sorry I left without talking to you. I just needed time. I needed to figure things out. I didn't know how to explain everything, but I'm thinking about everything. I need to figure out what matters to me, and I can't do that here. Please don't be mad at me. I'll be back soon." I read it through several times, each reading a little softer, a little more understanding. It wasn't the kind of explanation I had hoped for, but it was enough to make me feel like maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. Jake hadn't shut me out completely. He hadn't forgotten about us. He just needed space to find his way, and I understood that, even if it hurt. I sat at the table for a long time, letting the words sink in. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than sorrow. Hope. Jake hadn't given up. He hadn't abandoned me. He just needed time, and that was something I could give him. I folded the letter back up and placed it gently on the counter. The house still felt empty, but now it wasn't as oppressive. There was a chance. There was still a possibility that things could be different, that we could rebuild what had been broken. It was a small hope, but it was enough to keep me moving forward. A few weeks passed in a blur of routine. The house felt strange, quieter than I could have imagined, even with Dan back. The tension was still thick in the air, but there was something different now. Jake's letter had given me a sliver of hope, but the weight of his absence still lingered. I couldn't help but feel like we were all stuck, caught between what had been and what was yet to come. One afternoon, I found myself at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, staring out the window, lost in thought. The world outside seemed so distant, so separate from the heaviness inside the house. Then I noticed a small envelope on the counter, one I hadn't seen before. My heart skipped when I recognized the handwriting. It was Jake's. I opened it slowly, the anticipation making my hands tremble. Inside was another letter. His words were simple but filled with so much more meaning than I had expected. "I'm sorry for the way I left. I just needed time. I didn't know how to explain it then, but I'm figuring things out. Please don't think I don't care. I just needed some space to breathe. I'll be back soon. I promise." I read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. There was so much left unsaid between us, but this letter was different. It wasn't just an apology, it was a bridge, a promise that he wasn't lost, that there was still a chance to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was a start. It was enough. Sitting there in the quiet of the kitchen, I finally allowed myself to feel something other than fear or sadness. I felt hope, small but real. Jake wasn't gone forever. He had just needed space to figure things out, and maybe in time he would return, and we could start rebuilding what we had lost. Maybe it wouldn't be the same, but it could still be something. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Things weren't perfect, and I didn't have all the answers, but I knew now that there was a way forward, one step at a time, with patience and understanding. The future, for once, didn't seem so bleak. Weeks passed, and I found myself waiting, not just for Jake, but for something to change. The house, though quieter than before, no longer felt like an empty shell. There was a different kind of stillness now, one that didn't suffocate me, but allowed room for something new to grow. I didn't know when Jake would return, but I had learned to accept the uncertainty. There was no point in holding on to fear any longer. Then, one evening, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the sound of it startled me. I walked to the door, my heart unexpectedly pounding, a mix of nerves and hope. I opened it slowly, and there, standing on the other side, was Jake. He looked different. Not in a dramatic way, but there was something about him that seemed a little lighter, as if he had shed some of the weight he'd been carrying for so long. He stood there for a moment, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie, his eyes meeting mine with an awkward hesitation. The air between us was thick with everything unsaid, but this time, it felt like we were both ready to speak. "Hi," he said, his voice soft but steady. I didn't know how to come back, but I've been thinking a lot, and I wanted to see you." I nodded, my own words catching in my throat. I couldn't quite figure out what to say. There were so many things I wanted to ask, but somehow, all I could do was open the door wider, inviting him in. "I'm glad you're here," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake stepped inside, his gaze flickering around the familiar but strange house. It had been so long since we had shared the same space like this, and it felt almost unreal. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking, just taking in the fact that we were in the same place again, after everything that had happened. Finally, I broke the silence. "You don't have to explain everything right now," I said, my voice more sure than I expected. "We can talk when you're ready." Jake looked at me, his eyes softening. "I think I'm ready now," he said, taking a deep breath. "I just needed to figure out who I was and what I wanted. I didn't know how to do that with everything happening here." I nodded, understanding more than I could put into words. It was a truth I had already accepted. Sometimes people needed space to find themselves, to become who they were meant to be. And Jake was no different. We sat down together on the couch, the silence between us no longer suffocating but comfortable. It wasn't the loud, joyous reunion I had imagined, but it was real, and that was enough. As the evening went on, we talked, slowly at first, about little things, what he'd been doing, how he had spent his time away. The conversation meandered, but the air between us felt lighter, more open. We didn't resolve everything in one night, but we didn't need to. The first step had been taken. Jake was home, and though there was still a long way to go, it felt like we had begun the journey back to each other. It wasn't a perfect fix, and there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time I felt hopeful, and that was enough.